It started on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the kind where the sunlight spills lazily across the apartment floor, and the hum of the city outside feels distant, almost irrelevant. I was halfway through a lukewarm cup of coffee, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, when a message notification lit up my screen. I didn't recognize the sender number at first, but then the familiar name appeared. Daniel. My boyfriend. I tapped the message with an idle curiosity, expecting maybe a casual, "Hey, how's your day?" or a mundane reminder about dinner plans. Instead, the words jumped off the screen in a way that made my stomach tighten. "I'm inviting my new friend to meet my parents this weekend. You'll just have to sit this one out." I stared at it, blinked, then reread it. The phrasing felt deliberate, almost casual, as if he were telling me the weather instead of dismantling my sense of belonging in one cruel sweep. My mind raced, a blur of disbelief and hurt colliding in a jarring dance. Sit this one out? How could he decide that so easily, as if my presence were optional, negotiable? I set the phone down for a moment, trying to breathe. The city sounds outside my window seemed distant, muted, like I had suddenly become detached from the world. A whirlwind of emotions spun inside me. Anger, sadness, confusion, humiliation. I could feel my hands trembling as I reached for my phone again. "Thanks for letting me know," I typed, my fingers hovering over the screen before hitting send. It felt like the only response that maintained some semblance of dignity, though inside I was anything but calm. I didn't want to argue, didn't want to beg, didn't want to make it easy for him to see the chaos he had created. I leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Was this new friend someone he had known for a long time, someone he wanted my approval to impress? Or was it simply a test, a way to see how far he could push me without me pushing back? The questions multiplied, each one sharper than the last. My parents' annual weekend dinner had been scheduled for months. It was something I usually looked forward to, the chance to catch up with family, hear my mother's over-enthusiastic retelling of every trivial accomplishment, and let my father's wry humor color the evening. Now the thought of attending that dinner felt impossible. The idea of sitting across from them, forcing a smile while my boyfriend introduced someone else as the new friend who apparently superseded me, it was unbearable. After a long pause, I made a decision. I would not go, but I needed a way out that preserved some dignity, some excuse that wouldn't lead to awkward questions or suspicion. I picked up the phone and dialed my mother, forcing a cheerful tone I did not feel. "Hey, Mom. I know the dinner's this weekend. I'm so sorry, but something urgent at work came up. I'll have to miss it," I said, my voice just steady enough to sound plausible. She sounded disappointed but understanding, the kind of understanding that only parents can offer without pressing too hard. With that out of the way, I began searching for options. Flights, trains, hotels. I needed distance, both physical and emotional. Somewhere far from Daniel, from his casual cruelty, from the entire scenario that had unfolded in mere seconds on a glowing screen. I booked a last-minute trip to a quiet coastal town, imagining the waves crashing against the shore, the salty air clearing the fog in my head. Packing was a blur. I didn't even unpack my suitcase from the last trip. I simply grabbed clothes, toiletries, and essentials, stuffing them into my bag with frantic energy. Every movement was driven by a mix of adrenaline and a desperate desire to reclaim control. By the time I zipped the suitcase shut, the apartment felt different. Smaller, heavier, filled with the echo of words I could not unhear. As I waited for my ride to the airport, my phone buzzed again. I didn't look. I didn't need to. Whatever message he had sent, whatever explanation or apology or rationalization, I didn't care at that moment. I was focused on leaving, on creating a space where I could breathe without the weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. The airport was chaotic, filled with the usual mix of travelers, families, business people, couples, all moving with purpose. I watched them pass, feeling strangely detached, as if I were observing from behind a glass wall. Boarding the plane, settling into the window seat, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, letting the rising sun warm my face as the engines roared to life. The plane lifted, and with each passing second, the city, my apartment, and the text from Daniel became smaller, distant, almost unreal. I allowed myself a long, shaky exhale. For the first time since that message, I felt a spark of relief, a fleeting sense of freedom. I didn't know what would happen when I returned. I didn't know if Daniel would call, text, or even show up at my parents' house expecting me to explain myself. But for now, I had carved out a space that was entirely mine. The waves would crash, the wind would blow, and I would exist in that moment without compromise, without humiliation, without waiting for someone else's permission to be there. And yet, in the back of my mind, a persistent whisper of anxiety lingered. How would he explain my absence? Would he understand the depth of my hurt? Or would he act as though it were my fault? As though I were the one overreacting? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the horizon, the endless stretch of water, and the fragile, temporary peace that only distance could provide. Hours passed in a quiet blur. I walked along the beach as soon as I arrived, letting the sand sink between my toes, letting the ocean's vastness remind me of my own strength. I thought about the texts, the casual cruelty, and the ease with which he had tried to erase me from a significant moment. I thought about the upcoming dinner, the family waiting, the explanations he would have to give. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider that maybe this was a turning point. Maybe this act of choosing myself, of refusing to participate in a scene designed to humiliate me, was more powerful than any apology he could muster. That night, lying in a small, quiet hotel room with the sound of waves filling the silence, I realized something important. This was not just about a missed dinner. This was about respect, about boundaries, about recognizing when love and loyalty are one-sided. And I resolved, with a clarity I had never felt before, that no text, no casual dismissal, could diminish my self-worth. As I drifted off to sleep, the moonlight spilling across the room, I felt a mix of sorrow and empowerment. The story was far from over, but for now, I had taken the first step in reclaiming my narrative. Daniel could face the dinner alone, could explain my absence to anyone who asked, but I would exist outside of that small, confined drama, alive, free, and unshaken by someone else's choices. The next morning, the hotel room was bathed in a soft golden light. The waves outside were relentless, crashing against the shore with a rhythm that seemed to echo the tumult in my chest. I sipped a cup of mediocre hotel coffee, staring out the window, letting my mind wander to Daniel, to the dinner, to the text that had upended everything. I couldn't stop replaying it, over and over, each repetition sharpening the edges of my anger and disappointment. I tried to focus on the sound of the surf, the seagulls circling above, the mundane rhythm of the small coastal town, but my thoughts kept drifting. I imagined him, probably brushing off the consequences of his message, assuming I'd fold under the pressure or simply vanish from the situation quietly. I knew better. I had chosen this path for myself, for my dignity. Sitting silently while someone else replaced me in the narrative of my own life was never an option. While wandering along the boardwalk later, I noticed couples holding hands, laughing, absorbed in each other's worlds. I felt a pang of envy, a bitter twist of longing for what I had thought was secure with Daniel. That longing mingled with a sharper emotion, a realization that what I had once assumed to be love was fraught with imbalance, with disregard for boundaries. Each step I took along the worn wooden planks felt like a reclamation of my agency. By midday, I had found a quiet cafe overlooking the water. I ordered a sandwich and a sparkling water, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to sit still, to process without panic. I opened my journal, something I hadn't touched in months, and began writing. Words flowed easily, unrestrained, fueled by raw emotion, frustration, sorrow, and a burgeoning sense of self-respect. I wrote about the text, about the humiliation I had avoided, about the courage it took to walk away. Not from him, necessarily, but from the scenario he had orchestrated. I realized that my reaction had been more than avoidance. It was assertion. It was the quiet, steadfast declaration that I would not be marginalized in my own life, not by a casual remark, not by a fleeting decision, not by anyone. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cafe floor. Later, I walked along a secluded stretch of beach. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes with the salt in the air. I imagined Daniel at my parents' dinner, perhaps awkwardly attempting to explain why I wasn't there. I smiled, a small private gesture of triumph. For the first time, I felt a thrill in asserting my boundaries and taking control of my story. As evening approached, I returned to the hotel, exhausted but strangely elated. The solitude, the clarity, the space to reflect, it was intoxicating. I remembered the countless times I had compromised, the endless cycle of forgiveness and reconciliation, the quiet acceptance of minor slights. Now I could see those moments with stark clarity. This trip, this act of self-preservation, was different. It was deliberate. It was powerful. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of the waves, feeling a strange mixture of peace and anticipation. What would happen when I returned? Would Daniel understand the consequences of his casual cruelty? Would he even notice the absence of my presence beyond the immediate inconvenience? These questions hovered like distant clouds, but they no longer held me captive. I had chosen my own path, and that choice felt like victory. The following day, I explored the town with a quiet sense of purpose. I wandered through art galleries, small shops, and narrow streets, allowing myself to engage with the world without the constant shadow of Daniel's decisions. Each interaction, each small adventure, reinforced the notion that life continued beyond his whims, that my happiness did not depend on his actions or approval. During a late afternoon stroll along the pier, I overheard snippets of conversation from a nearby couple. They spoke of loyalty, of respect, of the delicate balances that sustain relationships. The words struck me sharply, as if echoing my own reflections. I realized that this weekend, this escape, had become more than just a physical retreat. It had become a crucible for understanding the true nature of love, of boundaries, of respect. As night fell, I sat on the balcony of my hotel room, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. Watching the horizon blur into darkness, I felt a growing clarity about what I wanted, what I deserved, and what I would no longer tolerate. The distance from Daniel, the removal from the situation, had crystallized my emotions into something tangible. A quiet, unyielding resolve. I knew the confrontation, when it came, would be inevitable. He would face the dinner, explain my absence, and confront the ripple effects of his choices. And I would not be there to soften the impact, to apologize for feeling hurt, to navigate his discomfort. The thought was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. I allowed myself to acknowledge the fear, but I did not let it dominate me. This was my weekend, my choice, my narrative. By the end of the day, I had crafted a mental script of how I would handle the aftermath, calm, composed, and unwavering. I would not be dragged into guilt or manipulation. I would listen, perhaps, but I would not surrender the boundaries I had fought so hard to establish. That night, as I drifted to sleep once more, I felt the first true sense of independence in months. The trip had done more than remove me from a humiliating scenario. It had illuminated the strength I had been neglecting, the voice I had been silencing. I fell asleep with a sense of quiet triumph, knowing that the weekend, though born of conflict, had become a turning point in my understanding of love, self-respect, and the courage to act when it matters most. When I returned home, the city felt the same, yet entirely different. Familiar streets, familiar buildings, familiar routines, all seemed smaller, almost trivial, compared to the emotional journey I had just endured. The apartment smelled faintly of Daniel's cologne lingering in the air, a subtle reminder that my absence had not erased him from my life entirely. But I had changed. I had returned with clarity, with boundaries firmly in place, with the quiet strength of someone who had chosen herself over convenience or compromise. I didn't know exactly what to expect when I walked through the door. Would Daniel be waiting, brimming with defensive explanations or remorseful pleas? Would my parents have called, leaving voicemails colored with concern or subtle disappointment? My chest tightened at the thought, a nervous anticipation that made my heart pound in my ears. As I stepped into the apartment, the silence was immediate, heavy, almost palpable. No welcome mat of words, no anxious glances, no hurried explanations. I set my bag down and exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. And then I heard it, the faint buzz of a missed call followed by a text. "Where are you? You missed dinner." I read it, the words flat and empty now, stripped of their power over me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. I could reply, I could explain, I could justify, or I could simply let the silence speak louder than any text ever could. I chose the latter. Later that evening, I learned that Daniel had indeed gone to the dinner. Alone. He had walked into my parents' home, attempting to explain my absence, fumbling through excuses that sounded thin even to him. I imagined the scene vividly. My father's raised eyebrows, my mother's cautious questions, the subtle tension as he struggled to navigate a situation he had created. The thought brought a faint, vindictive satisfaction, a quiet affirmation that my decision had not only protected me, but also exposed him to the consequences of his own choices. I reflected on the weekend again, on the waves, the solitude, the journals filled with raw emotion. Each moment had reinforced my understanding of love and respect. I realized that relationships, no matter how intimate, required a balance of consideration, communication, and empathy. Daniel's text had been a breach of that balance, a careless act that revealed the fragility of the connection I had assumed was strong. In the following days, our interactions were strained, but telling. He reached out cautiously, his messages measured, as if testing the waters, gauging my response. I responded minimally, carefully maintaining the distance I had established, letting the quiet act as both shield and statement. His discomfort, his realization that I would not bend to his whims, was palpable even through digital communication. One evening, as I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker and pulse, I considered the broader implications of what had transpired. This was not simply about a missed dinner or a thoughtless text. It was about self-respect, about the courage to assert boundaries, about recognizing when love becomes conditional or dismissive. The weekend escape had been a catalyst, a revelation that transformed a moment of betrayal into a lesson in strength. Eventually, a conversation did happen, face to face. Daniel approached with hesitance, the casual arrogance replaced by a tentative awareness. We spoke, measured words exchanged carefully, emotions laid bare without compromise. I expressed my hurt, my disappointment, my refusal to accept such casual dismissal in the future. He listened, genuinely, I think, for the first time understanding the depth of the impact of his actions. The discussion did not erase the past, nor did it instantly restore the balance in our relationship, but it marked a shift, a recognition that love required accountability, that respect could not be assumed, that boundaries were not negotiable. I felt a quiet pride in my ability to stand firm, to act decisively, to reclaim my agency without resorting to anger or vindictiveness. Over the following weeks, our relationship evolved, reshaped by the events of that weekend. There were difficult moments, adjustments, the occasional flash of old habits, but the foundation had changed. Mutual respect became a guiding principle, communication more intentional, awareness of each other's boundaries more pronounced. I realized that this confrontation, born of a single thoughtless text, had transformed our dynamic, demanding growth, honesty, and vulnerability from both of us. Looking back, I recognized the significance of my choice to leave, to step away, to refuse to participate in a scenario that compromised my dignity. That decision, made in the quiet of a distant hotel room, had set the tone for everything that followed. It was a lesson in self-respect, in courage, in the power of choosing oneself when circumstances demand it. And in the end, it was not about victory over Daniel, or proving a point, or orchestrating drama. It was about reclaiming my narrative, asserting my worth, and understanding that love, to endure, must be grounded in respect, empathy, and the willingness to honor the other's boundaries as fiercely as one's own. The waves continued to crash in my memory, a symbol of resilience, of relentless motion, of the quiet yet undeniable force of choosing oneself in the face of casual cruelty. I had faced the moment, navigated the aftermath, and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken, wiser, and more certain of the kind of love I deserved.